Today we have an interesting conversation with Professor Amitav Acharya of American University. Professor Acharya is perhaps one of the most leading scholars of IR coming from the Global South. And both of us were presidents of ISA, the first two Global South people of origin. And I have a lot of appreciation personally for Amitav's contribution, not just for scholarship, but for institution building and making international studies a discipline, as well as ISA, at least partially global association today and global discipline today. And Amitav has contributed immensely to enriching, broadening this discipline. And today we are going to talk a little bit about his new project on civilization state that he has taken up. He was just talking to me about a new book potentially coming out of Yale University Press on this big subject. But he just published or about to publish an article on the subject of civilization state, its constraints, its limitations, and its possibilities in the journal called Ethics and International Affairs. So welcome, Amitav. It's a pleasure to chat with you. This is very informal. We just want to know why is the civilizational state idea is back? Obviously, we have electoral, ethnic mobilization, status achievement by some of these states, but it seems it's beyond what Huntington and others said. It's just a short-term phenomenon, or is it something, a very catchy thing? And you tackle that very well in an article. Just summarize for this audience very briefly what your take on it.
Thank you, Professor T.V. Paul. I'm very glad to be in your program. And thanks for the question on civilization states. Actually, some people also call it civilization state, others call it civilizational state. I call it civilization state. This is a concept that's been going around for the past few years. It's not entirely new, but it is a little different from the previous idea of like Huntington's idea of a class of civilizations. So when Huntington talked about class of civilizations, he actually did not make a clear distinction between civilization and state. In fact, he conflated them. So civilizations were actually to him units by themselves. And even though he was very state-centric in his analysis. But lately, some scholars and media people, for example, Gideon Rackman from Financial Times, they've been talking about a civilizational state or civilization state as if it's a kind of a emerging new entity to replace the nation state. So we have had nation state, a system of nation states for the last 300-400 years, and the argument is that civilization state will replace it or subsume it. And this is because looking at countries like India, China, Russia, Turkey, where their leaders are trying to identify themselves in terms of their civilizations, as opposed to having a more secular and open kind of cultural identity. And this came about partly because leaders like Modi, Prime Minister Modi in India, have been talking about, very frequently talks about India's Vedic civilization or Indus Valley civilization. Their government has been, the BJP government in India has been trying to rewrite history in some ways to give the Indian history more of a Vedic flavor, that Indian Vedic civilization was actually born in India, not brought in by migrants or nomadic Aryans, so to speak, Indo-Aryans. In China, there's a lot of talk about concepts like Tianxia, harmony, Confucianism. In Turkey, there is Erdogan has been trying to identify himself more as an Islamic leader, as opposed to in the Kemalist tradition of looking at Turkey as a secular state. And then in Russia, we have Putin also, and the Russian elite, not all of them, talking about Russia's role as a civilization in itself, not part of the Western civilization, but a Eurasian civilization. Some people even call Russia as the third Rome after the fall of the Roman Empire, the first Roman Empire, and then about the Byzantine Empire. So this has gotten to the sort of attention and in fact the nerve of some Western writers. So we think this is an attack on liberalism and the liberal international order. This is further proof that the liberal order is collapsing. Now, my goal in this paper is to write, to challenge that. But I think my argument is very simple, that there is no question that leaders of some countries are trying to use civilization for domestic politics and even foreign policy. No question about it. But not everybody in those countries who use civilization are trying to do that. Yeah. There are actually some scholars and public intellectuals who are genuinely interested in using civilization as a basis for making a theoretical philosophical statement. As you and I know only too well, international relations is based on Western civilization. It's a very American, European civilizational discourse.
Connected
so when even when scholars from China, India, and Turkey, I don't know much about Russia in that sense, they talk about their past. They're not necessarily justifying the governments. They are simply saying this is a fertile source for deriving concepts like Ashoka's Dharma, Kautilya as a source of realism, or Chinese moral realism, as Jan Swetang talks about. That may or may not overlap with the government agenda, but I don't think that's what people are doing. What they are trying to do is to open up the space of higher theory and engage their Western counterparts who are still relying on a very traditional European civilizational discourse without acknowledging it. So I wrote this article to expose that this civilizational state idea is a way of conceptualizing international relations theory from the global South, drawing on local culture. It doesn't mean that this is supporting the governments all the time. I also make the point that if you want to look at how governments are playing culture, the culture card, that is also being done in the West. President Trump isn't talking about Western civilization. The European Union is a civilizational grouping. I mean, it rejected Turkey's membership a decade and a half ago, because Turkey was a Muslim state. So why not then write about those civilizations? I mean, that kind of a Western discourse. And if you look at civilizational state discourse, it's all about the emerging powers. Yeah. It's all about India, China, Russia.
So that's a very interesting point. I mean, if you look at all imperial projects had some civilizational content to them, the more enduring ones. And obviously these countries are trying to seek more international status, more position in the governance structures. But one other thing about even Indian civilization, take for example, is what Amartya Sen calls, it's sort of the argumentative tradition. It's also the tradition of inclusiveness. And you find that is a challenge for all these alternate arrangements. They don't seem to care about non-ethnic or non-majoritarian components of the civilization. And I think that does not then give a powerful challenge to the liberal order, because it is, whatever its deficiencies, it still has some inclusiveness in it, which is where I think the alternatives don't look appealing to anyone who wants to be part of it. I mean, you and I come from Indian civilization, but we are not probably going to be included in that notion of civilization. I think that's a big challenge, the inclusiveness part. And how do you translate that in the global governance arrangement? If you're saying we are going to represent a majoritarian viewpoint, the Russian, whatever ethnic, Chinese ethnic group, or India too, or Turkey, and what does that do to the notion of your own idea of a multiplex system in the governance structures and the need for creating more inclusive orders?
So you raised quite a number of points, and let me try to address them as many of those as I can. First of all, this civilizational state idea takes a very short, limited view of history. Now, I'm also writing a book. The book I'm writing is not about civilizational state, although there will be a chapter. It actually looks at, it's a comparative civilization book, looking at civilizations in Asia, Africa, Latin America, or before Columbian America, the Aztecs and Mayas and Incas, as well as Europe and the United States. And one thing that comes out very clearly to me, and this is very fundamental to my position on this issue, is that all civilizations are eclectic. They have mixed elements. They have rational elements. They have mystical elements. They are realist. They are liberal or idealist, liberal, and they have elements of war and the peace. And just to give you one example from India, within the same single dynasty called Maurya, we had two representations, two worldviews. One, the Kautilya, very kind of realist, although he's not as a hyper-realist as people think. But you also have Ashoka, who was as idealist as after the war in Kalinga, as it gets. In China, in the warring states, you have the legalists who are very realist, and to use a modern concept, and then you have Confucians who are very idealist. Islam has the same tradition. In Islam, you have very theological orthodox traditions who believe in the existence of God and God created everything. But you have people like Averroes or Ibn Rushd who believe in the doctrine of eternity of the world, which said that God did not create the universe. So this is, and Islam also has traditions of both peacefulness, just war, not to attack or kill civilians in combat, and they also have very aggressive streaks.
Yes.
So that's my point, that it's very hard to stereotype civilizations as a realist or idealist, rational or irrational, or, in that sense, good or bad. Every civilization is eclectic. Yes. So my idea in the book is to bring out that eclectic dimension. So civilizations are by definition plural, they're not singular. And they're not an island. They are always, even the Chinese civilization, which is supposed to be very homogeneous, or Japanese society, they're deeply influenced by other civilizations.
Buddhism influenced, they went to Nalanda to study Indian.
Exactly, Xuanzang in the 7th century AD. So, and Islam is even more eclectic, because Islam is actually not confined to one or two states, like a Hindu civilization, or Chinese civilization in a region. Islam is global. Yes. And the Islam of Abbasid Caliphate is not the same as the Islam of Indonesia, Islam of Ottomans, or Islam of Fatimid Egypt. So we have to understand these are not stereotype civilized. That is multiplex, by the way. If you bring in this eclectic, diverse element of civilizations, then you say that the return of civilization doesn't mean just a majoritarian. I mean, of course, India is a Hindu majority state, but in India, look at how many fights are going on between the Hindu nationalists and the non-nationalists. This is a major problem. I mean, this is also makes a mockery of the civilizational state idea. Because, Modi, who has been talking about civilization, it may be out of power in the next election. He's deeply unpopular now. And partly because nobody believes in that kind of Hindutva ideology. And the Indians are waking up to this. In Turkey, there is a similar resentment against Islamization. So all I'm saying is the civilizational state is bound up with the regime security rather than national identity. And the regime security is transient. Regimes come and go. Therefore, demonizing the use of civilization for foreign policy, and for me, I'm more interested in actually international relations theory, is actually totally overreaction, to say the very, very least.
So what's the connection to global IR that you've been working with Barry Buzan in recent book, and you've done a lot of research before that? There are those who would argue that it is still an amorphous concept. It needs more specificity and all that. But I applaud the concept and the idea of working toward creating a more multiplex order. How do we achieve that? And one of the challenges you just identified, these other alternate worldviews, sometimes don't come with something that is tangible, implementable. For instance, the notion of democracy, which I think is very crucial we don't want to take Western democracy as the role model, but clearly the liberal democratic idea is fundamentally something that has not been easy to challenge. Any other order cannot create that kind of representation, power transition without violence, a lot of pluses to it, but a lot of minuses. I mean, we all know that. But the point is, alternative systems are not offering anything comparable for, although they use democratic electoral platforms, and even at the global governance systems, now these countries want more democracy participation, but how do we translate these domestic illiberal ideas into global system of governance? And there is the disjunction between what we are doing internally and what we were seeking externally.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm trying to say?
Yes, yes. Let me start with that. So the idea of a liberal democracy or the idea of authoritarianism, they're very broad concepts. There are wide variations within each group. We know that American democracy is not the same as European democracy, social democracy. I mean, in Britain, somebody like Trump will not last more than 3 months, or the Supreme Court will not be as politicized. In Northern Europe, the social democracy model is very different from the market individualistic model. And in same with authoritarianism, we have dictatorships, we have semi-authoritarian states, and we have democracies. I mean, look at we have transitional democracies. So China is not the same kind of authoritarian state as say Singapore, for example. And that's basically has been the reality. The liberal scholars have idealized a particular form of democracy, and they see this as a model. I don't blame them for that, and I speak as a big defender of democracy, and many Indians grow up with democracy, and we are all influenced by the attraction of the democratic ideal. But that's not blind us from the fact that there are variations. And oftentimes there will be a hybridity. Hybridity means mix of some democratic elements, some cultural elements, some communitarian elements, some individualistic elements. So in that sense, the idea of a liberal order should embrace that diversity and still try to emphasize the more open, more rights-oriented, the kind of system that gives you more rights, individual rights, respects human dignity and freedom, as opposed to sort of dismiss everything that doesn't look like American or European. Yeah, that's arrogance. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, to go back to your particular question, there are, I don't think alternatives, but there are variations. And those variations are not incompatible with each other. I'm not going to say Putin's Russia is same as, India or Japan or United States. But there are a lot of in-between positions, and that's the reality of the world. So moving on to that, to global IR. Global IR embraces this diversity. Now you said what is if global IR doesn't come across as a amorphous, as a sort of coherent or a precise notion? Actually, it was intended like that. Global IR is not a theory of international relations. It's a framework to bring in diverse perspectives. And I want to be very clear about it. A global IR can accommodate very different theoretical perspectives. It's agnostic about whether you're a realist or a liberal or a constructivist or a Marxist. The main claim of global IR is that whatever theory you do, try to be as inclusive and genuinely universal. Don't bring in something from Europe and say this is universal. Yes. You try to look at, you may find that in other societies, there may not be exact replicas of democracy or human rights, but there will be approximations of that idea. For example, the idea of dharma in Ashoka, actually, and Amartya Sen has talked about it. It's like a proto-human rights or human security. Similarly, just war, I like to give this example of just war. The just war tradition has roots in every society. There's an Islamic tradition, there is a Confucian tradition, there's a Manu's Manusmriti, the laws of Manu.
Krishna tells Arjuna.
Word by word, yes. Like Geneva Conventions. Yeah. Almost by word, and I think you will see that a part of that in some of my other writings. Similarly, we have Christian traditions. So why don't we look at these commonalities and get something out of it, as opposed to creating binaries or either or. And global IR is not a binary. It's not an either or. It's basically finding common ground.
Yeah.
Now, the downside of global IR, therefore, is that it may not be very good in theorizing. So you cannot have a deductive theorizing, but you can. It just needs further work, and people are waking up to doing that.
Yeah,
That means
you may need to go on specific themes and try to address.
I think it's more for mid-range theories.
Yeah,
so you can derive concepts and ideas, and whether you want to do this scientifically or in a more classical way, you can do that. But another thing I want to emphasize that global IR does not accept what is called civilizational exceptionalism or cultural exceptionalism from the very beginning. And this is one of the confusions or errors, or maybe deliberately ignoring this, some critics, that global IR is somehow encouraging this regional schools like the Chinese school. Actually, global IR thinks these are good things, more the better, because it gives voice to a local community. But it also says that one should not be exceptionalist or culturally arrogant in the other way. And it's very clear. It's something I call identity without exceptionalism. Cultural exceptionalism and idea of cultural superiority not part of it. But global IR also thinks that for a theory to be really, more receptive, complementary to global IR, it must travel. It cannot be simply about that one country. So like English school is not about England. So the Chinese school cannot be about China only. And there is an Indian school. It should not just explain Indian foreign policy. And another thing is it must have a critical mass. You can't have one or two scholars saying this is a Chinese school or this is the Indian school. You must have a critical mass and a research agenda. You must have people doing dissertations and writing articles using that theory, which hasn't happened very much in the Chinese school yet. And finally, I say stay away from policy. Although it is very common in the West, look at how many American IR scholars are in government and vice versa, revolving door. There's no, barrier to American scholars championing either Obama or Trump, a liberal or a Democrat or Republican. So this is going to happen to every academic community, but I think that has to be still some distance.
I agree, but I think it's a very laudable enterprise. What is missing is engagement on critical themes. This whole global research network that I'm part of it or initiated, the effort is to bring in the idea of peaceful change in different cultures, civilization, different societies. And so we have an Oxford University Press handbook coming out on it. And what is interesting is every society, like you said, has some notions of peace and peaceful change. Almost every society and cultures and civilization approaches. But we often kind of ignore those, we means especially in the West, or in the East too, we sort of highlight our contributions. But I agree that this is a mix of contribution. What the world today is not created by any single country or civilization. The world is very much multiple entry points, engagements. And so I think it is a fascinating project. But how do we encourage our younger scholars in different countries, including these rising powers, to engage each other? Like the Chinese scholars, they're very much into China's civilizational approach, or Indian scholars. How do you ask them to meet each other? I mean, there are very few like you who can travel between these civilizations and engage them each other. Because without that engagement, we may get still these islands of theories or approaches. And that will be our final question, because we have a half an hour limitation, I think.
I think you need to do two things. There are two elements to this bringing scholars together under a global IR project. One is the dialogue between the Western scholars and the so-called non-Western scholars. And some of that happens because there are a lot of people from Global South already in the West, and they do that. But they don't talk to each other. They talk past each other. So it's important to have that kind of dialogue. And hopefully in places like ISA, although ISA is in that sense not a perfect forum, there is still a lot of gatekeeping in forums like ISA, even though it's getting better, but it's not there. The other thing is that dialogue and conversations across the Global South countries. Now that is was very difficult in the past, but it's not as bad as you think. I mean, there's a lot of meetings involving Chinese scholars and non-Chinese. I actually co-direct a project with Rajiv Vargava of Delhi and Yan Swetong and Daniel Bell, called China India Comparative Civilization IR project, where we are bringing about 9 10 Chinese scholars, 9 and 10 Indian scholars after to write joint papers. And we have 3 meetings, and hopefully a book will come out. And this is happening, but I'm not minimizing the problem. I think we need a long way to go to have that kind of dialogue. But I think the problem is, and honestly, the problem is not China, the problem is not India. Scholars from there will go anywhere to engage. It's the problem is in the West, and particularly in the United States, because the United States is in a privileged position. IR is still in many ways American social science. In the big journals, departments, this is empirically proven. It's diminishing, but not diminishing. American dominance is not diminishing as much as one should. And why should they give up? They're in a privileged position. And there's a lot of gatekeeping in journals, a lot, even people like me get into the gatekeeping. Despite all my publications, now I want to publish a book focusing on Global South Agency, and that goes to 2 traditional Western reviewers, and they say, what is this agency of the Global South? So it's a battle you have to fight, but I think ultimately, and IR is a young science, it's been there for 100 years, but really, as an international science, it's been only 20, 30 years. IR has become more popular outside of the West. And hopefully, slowly, it will change. And even if it doesn't change, we should not just be discouraged by that. We should keep writing and promoting that conversation, not talking within. It's not good for Global South scholars to talk to each other only.
Yes.
Just as it's not good for South and North scholars to talk past each other. They should talk to each other.
Well, that was our effort at ISA when we were in charge for a brief period to bring together North and South and East and West to engage, and we have made some partial achievements. So thank you, Amitav, and this has been a very exciting conversation with someone who is doing something fantastic, and I think our colleagues in different parts of the world will continue work. So we should continue this discussion.